Thank you guys for joining us today. Again, my name is Victor Verba, and we appreciate doing these for everybody. Today, what we're going to do is we're going to focus a little bit on some of our latest enhancements, and that is our Zoom Cradle-to-Grave. And how we can leverage Cradle-to-Grave to really kind of build some in-depth reports on some of maybe your call queues is what we'll focus in on. If we've got some times, we'll look at some other ways to be able to use some of the Cradle-to-Grave as well. If you're looking to know a little bit more about what the Cradle-to-Grave is, Mike, I'm going to have Mike post a link to a previous webinar we did with our other engineer, Matt Sykes, who went a little bit further in depth into what Cradle-to-Grave is and reading Cradle-to-Grave. For today's session, we're going to go ahead and focus a little bit more on what we can do with some of that Cradle-to-Grave, what we learned from Matt, what Cradle-to-Grave is, and how we can leverage it for some call queue information. So jumping right into it, I'm jumping into my bat cave here, and this is one of our Zoom locations. And I'm going to start by focusing in on a particular call queue. So I'm going to do that by just adjusting my search set, and I could either scroll down to my call queue section, or I could just type in queue here and bring up my call queues. Now, this is going to be a list of all of the call queues that I have in my Zoom system here. So for the first demonstration, what we're going to do is we're going to focus in on our public relations here. I'm going to adjust the date and time that I want to search for this particular queue, and I'm just going to do the last 30 days so we get some good data and view our results. So essentially what this is going to bring back is just the actual call data. So we're looking at, the date and time and what columns we want to have here. I added my call queue column. And if you want to add some additional columns, you can always do that just by clicking the show hide columns button and moving something from left to right to add some additional columns in there. But what I'm looking at here is my public relations queue. And I see all the calls coming in. I see the users that are receiving the calls. I can see ring times, directions. I see the sites that they're coming from or going to, telephone numbers, some internal calls, things like that. So this is just kind of the standard detail, but we're going to build on now. So we're going to go ahead and turn on some Cradle-to-Grave and look at these calls a little bit deeper. So to do that, I'm just going to click export my results. That's going to bring us into the report building screen where I can do any number of things. I can add some different groupings in here. I can create some different summary criteria. And maybe we'll add a couple things in here. We're going to add some things like our abandoned call counts or our answered call counts. And, we'll add some voicemail call counts, although we don't have a lot of these calls going back to voicemail once they hit a queue, but we'll see what we can get here. So what I'm adding here is just some general summary information that's going to provide me a high-level overview of what's taking place in my public relations queue. So the next thing I want to do is look at my detail. I'm good on my columns because I added them in the background already, but we do want to turn on the Cradle-to-Grave piece. So to do that, we're going to go to our start to finish. In your system, that may say Cradle-to-Grave. This is a value that can be customized to better meet your environment. So in our environment, we changed Cradle-to-Grave, which is the default, to start to finish, and that can be done through the system settings. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to enable our Cradle-to-Grave, and then we're going to run the report, and we choose our delivery options, whether we want it in a CSV or HTML or PDF or anything like that. Now, in the interest of time, because I do have a lot to cover, I'm not going to kick all these reports off. I'm going to bring over the exact same report, just without having to run it. Again, predominantly looking more towards the interest of time here. So once we run that report, we can see our public relations. We see our total call count, average call duration, total call duration. In this particular example, I didn't have all the other fields in there, but they would appear right over here on the right-hand side. Then we see all the detail that we were looking at for our public relations department. We can see that we ran this from January 13th to February 11th. And here's all the detail. We get to see the site coming in. We see our public relations queues, all our end users, things like that. But you'll note the column on the right-hand side. This is our Cradle-to-Grave. That means these calls didn't just come into a queue and end at a queue. They went and did something. So what we're going to look at today is we're going to focus in on that Cradle-to-Grave. We're going to focus in on how we can leverage that to pull some more meaningful metrics. So for that, I'm going to go ahead and just click on one of these guys. And I've got some scenarios picked out. So essentially what we're looking at here are calls that are coming into queue, where they're going, who's answering them. Some calls are being transferred back out of queues. It's all great information to view, but how do I put this together in something that is meaningful? Looking at the detail itself is great, and I'm going to pull up a value here or one of our Cradle-to-Grave scenarios. So I'm going to scroll real fast. That can help us find some meaningful information. So this is a great example that we pulled out because what we could see is this call comes into our queue that actually doesn't get answered and rolls off to a different queue here. So this call ends up going to the employee engagement queue, where again, it overflows, doesn't get answered, goes back to an auto attendant, and then ends up back in our public relations queue, which again flows back out of our public relations into yet another queue, and finally gets answered by employee engagement. So this is a really good example, and I think we have a couple of these where it flows from queue to queue. But what we're going to do in this example is we're going to show you how to leverage your, here's another one, leverage your cradle to grave to find out how many times something like this is happening. In other words, how many times is something coming into one queue, not being answered, and then subsequently being redirected back to another queue. So that's a good metric because it helps you understand how your calls are being utilized. When we think of things like from a retail store or a big box store or a financial institution, we think of branches, we think of departments and things like that. I may have something that goes into branch A from a financial institution. Maybe it doesn't get answered in time, and then it rolls off to another queue that is maybe more of a larger call center. Well, what they're going to do with it is most likely just send it right back to the branch because somebody's trying to reach the branch. Or if we think of this from a retail store, this may be a call that goes into, let's say, your electronics department, doesn't get answered, and subsequently, again, goes back to a main office or something like that. But it's important to understand how often that's happening. Because those, from Verify's perspective as well as Zoom's perspective, they're not abandoned calls. So they're not going to show up in your abandonment ratio. But what we want to do is identify that. And that's what we're going to do here. We're going to take this cradle to grave and we're going to search and see how many times calls are coming to this employee engagement. So to do that, we're going to go back to our reporting. All right. So we're going to click export results again. And we've got our call history detail. We're going to keep that the same. We're going to keep our search sets the same. So really nothing we're going to change in here. But what I am going to do in my start to finish here is I'm going to change this a little bit. And I'm going to go ahead and do start to finish. And we're going to create a search in our cradle to grave. So let's take a look. What was the name of that queue? That was employee relations or something of that nature. So we're going to find it. So first thing we're going to do, now keep in mind, we're no longer searching in our search set. We're searching in our start to finish or our cradle to grave section. But what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and pick on a queue. And I believe the queue was employee engagement. There we go. So I'm going to give my search a name. We'll just say calls forward to employee engagement. So essentially what we're doing is in our cradle to grave, what we're doing is we're starting off with our basic search set. That's going to be exactly what we saw in this report. This is all my calls to public relations. But by adding a cradle to grave search set, essentially what we're doing is we're saying, now out of all of these calls that went to public relations, how many of them ended up hitting a different queue? And in this case, I'm going to say how many of them ended up hitting our employee engagement queue. So we're going to add that in there. So all I did was create a start to finish search. I added my search for my queue, and then I want to toggle on some stats because I want to see how often something like this is taking place. So I'm going to do my total count, my average count, my total call duration. Maybe I'm going to add things like my abandoned count, answered count, and I'm not going to add voicemail in here because, again, we don't have these really flowing back to voicemail. All right. So essentially what I did is just add some other statistics in here. We select our delivery option for HTML, and then we would go ahead and run it. I'm going to let that guy go ahead and run in the background, and while that does that, I'm going to show you what the result will be. So let me blow this guy up a little bit so y'all can see it. Go down one more. So essentially what we have is our search. That was all calls to the public relations department. And if I look at my old report and go up to the top of that guy, we can see we have our 129 calls that went to our public relations department. So in this example, I added a couple other fields that are important. You know, when we're talking about queues, we want to know how many calls are coming in, how many are being answered, how many are being abandoned, things like that. That's all kind of standard queue metrics. If you want to learn a little bit more about queue metrics, we will be doing a different webinar for Zoom regarding, you know, focusing strictly on call queues and things like that. But for this one, I really wanted to leverage the cradle to grave in this example. Now, you're going to notice something different on this report that really wasn't in the last report. So you'll notice this option here that says start to finish search criteria. Now, again, remember when I went to my report, I enabled that and I added employee engagement. So if I edit my report here, that guy's still running in the background. So, well, I'll show you that in a second. So what we have is our employee engagement. Now, what we're seeing here is that report just finished. What we're seeing here is the total volume of calls out of this 129 that ended up going to employee engagement, and how many of those ended up getting answered at employee engagement. So this is huge, because what this does is it really allows you to focus in on how some of your calls are routing throughout your environment, not necessarily looking at it from just the cradle to grave perspective, which again is great to be able to see, but providing some meaningful summary on how that information is being transmitted back and forth. Right. Now, in this one, I also added some users, some grouping, so I can see kind of who's taking calls and things like that, and break it down. But we did add the cradle to grave in here. So I could always click on the cradle to grave from any of my users and see all the calls that came to Kim or Bree or any of the users that I chose to add into this report. But the idea here is providing a little bit more summary. However, the only way to get this level of summary is by using cradle to grave, because if we look at our calls, let me go back up to my sequence 51 here that we were looking at earlier. There we go. When we see these calls, if I just search public relations without cradle to grave, I'm only going to see what's in orange. By adding cradle to grave, we're picking out the things that are not in orange and saying, oh, this is how many calls you have going to these other places after they went to public engagement, or after they went to public relations and then over to employee engagement. Now, you're not limited to just one. In this particular example with my public relations department right here, most of these calls are only going to end up rolling over to employee engagement. That's the way that we have our queue configured. But there's a lot of different ways to configure those queues. They can roll to different departments, different hunt groups. They can roll out to different departments or different sites. So with that in mind, we're going to go ahead and show another one here. So another common thing that we see, and we have people utilize cradle to grave for, is with their hunt groups, is understanding kind of how their calls are coming in or where they're coming from. We'll have a lot of people that will have calls that are external. In other words, internal people calling into your hunt group. But a lot of times they want to know, what about the internal people calling into my hunt group? Who's calling in, or where are those calls coming from? So this next example, we're going to focus in on a different queue. So I'm going to go ahead and change this up a little bit. We're going to remove our public relations, and we're going to go to our quality assurance. All right. So this queue I like because it gets more internal calls, but it also gets more external calls as well. So what we're doing here, and this is a report that we built for a customer, is they wanted to understand how their internal folks are utilizing it. In other words, where are most people calling from that are calling the quality assurance group? Is it certain regions, certain locations? And in their particular case, it was less about departments or location. It was more about the sites that were calling into quality assurance. So when we view our results here, this is going to bring back essentially all calls to quality assurance. So we can see that a lot of these come from the Maplewood fabrication site. But what they're looking to do is isolate summary and find out all of the different sites that are sending calls to quality assurance. So a couple different ways that we can do that. For this particular customer, essentially what we did is we just ran this report without any cradle to grave, without a lot of summary and search information, just to get an idea what the detail looked like. So I'm going to go ahead and run that right now, and we'll take a look at what that guy looks like. All right. So there we have our report. And this is essentially a one-to-one relationship. I did not turn on cradle to grave, and we know that because we don't have related links here on the right-hand side. But what we can see are all of the calling sites. Now, when there is no site, you can see these are inbound calls. So they're not coming from one of their internal sites. But what this customer is focusing on is understanding how their internal folks are using their various hunt groups. Because if the hunt group predominantly is meant to manage external communication, in other words, people calling in, I don't necessarily want a lot of people in my internal group calling that hunt group. They may have better ways to route those calls. And in this customer's case, that's exactly what it was. They had different groups for internal communications versus external, but they really needed to understand how their internal folks were using this particular queue. So what we could see here is the site that was calling in. And that's what we're going to focus in on here is we have all these different sites calling into my quality assurance group. So they're wondering, out of the 53 calls that came in, how many are coming from the various different caller sites? So what we did for them is we utilized Cradle-to-Grave. So we export our results. And again, we're going to go ahead and go to our start to finish reporting. And instead of looking at the called queue like we did for our previous report, and our previous report, remember, was different. We wanted to look at the called queue and say, okay, from this called queue, how many are going to this other called queue? And that's what we did here. But for this one, what we want to focus in on is something a little bit more. We want to focus in on the site that's calling in. So we're going to add a couple sites into this particular queue here. So we're going to add the list here. I'm going to pull up a list and we're going to pull this guy up. We're going to add, let's see, close this report out. And this report, let's add Cedar Valley in there. So we're going to say calls forward, calls from Cedar Valley. So we're going to add Cedar Valley in there, and then we're just going to add our Cedar Valley site. So we're going to add our Cedar Valley operations. But just because we have one doesn't mean we can't add more. So I'm going to create a new search in this case. And you'll notice all I did is I've had my Cedar Valley created. I just click create new search, and now I can create a new search here. So we're going to do Timberline systems here. So let's do Timberline. So calls from Timberline systems. There we go. And we're going to basically repeat, and we're going to say, okay, we want to see all the calls out of those 53 calls, how many came from the Timberline site. And we can continue to compound this. We'll go ahead and add one more in there. And what do I have? I've got Cedar, I've got Timberline. Let's go ahead and add, let's add Lakeside in there. So we'll do Lakeside Manufacturing. And I'm just going to copy that guy right out of there. And we're going to add another search in here. We'll say calls from Lakeside Manufacturing. And we're just going to add our site in here. And essentially what we're doing is we're just, again, isolating all of the different scenarios out of those 53 calls. If we step through this, essentially what we're doing is we're pulling out step one is we're getting all of the calls for quality assurance. Step two, out of all of the calls from 20 of quality assurance, how many came from Lakeside, how many came from Timberline, and how many came from Cedar Valley. Then we go ahead and we'll change our format here. Now, something I'm going to do a little bit different on this report than I did on the last report. And let me bring up that last report. So on that last report, let's see, where did it go? That's Maplewood. Let's go ahead and there we are. On that last report, we kept all the Cradle-to-Grave in there, and we kept all the detail in there. Now, I'm going to be totally honest with you. If I'm running this for a week and there's 1,000 calls in there, well, when we stop to think about Cradle-to-Grave, that could be like 5,000 rows of data. Most people on a weekly basis or even a daily basis aren't looking through that much data. They're really looking to identify the summary. So we're actually going to clean this report up a little bit when we run this one, because we don't need to see all of this. If we look at the top, we have what we want in the first two rows. How many came into our public relations and how many went to employee engagement. And that's what we want to be able to see. So we're going to do the same thing, but we're going to clean this report up a little bit. So in this one, we're going to keep our search. We're going to keep our summary values. But what we're going to do is we're going to actually turn off call detail. All right. In other words, we don't need all of this to look at. We just want a summary to know what sites are calling into my my quality assurance. So we're going to turn those guys off, and we'll make sure that that's off. We'll keep a little bit of summary on here. Maybe we can add some things again, like abandon or answered. We'll throw that in there. So that's it. We've made some changes. Then we run our report, and again, keeping in the interest of time, let's go ahead and show you what our end result would look like. And that is going to be a report that looks like this. Much more streamlined than what we were looking at from this guy that's got all the detail. Now what we're doing is we're identifying our calls into quality assurance, total volume, and then again, we can add other statistics on here. However, you'll notice the bottom section, and this is the key. Now what we're seeing out of those calls that are going into quality assurance, how many of those calls are coming from different parts of my internal organization? So we can see 15 calls from Cedar Valley, 3 calls from Lakeside Manufacturing, 9 calls from Timberline Systems. So this is a great way to get a nice, very clean report that's going to really isolate different ways your calls flow. Now, this is only a couple of different examples of ways to utilize this Cradle-to-Grave. And we see a lot of people doing this with their queues to just understand how that overflow is being used. We also see things where people will forward calls to outside answering services and things like that. Sometimes it's after hours if the queues get too busy. Quality Cradle to Grave is a great way to do that, because essentially what we can do is we can say, you know what, we see the calls coming in, and then what we're doing is we're going to pick out where they go to. And that's the best part about quality of having Cradle to Grave, is getting that visibility, not only where the calls come in, but where the calls go, but also being able to isolate from a summary perspective where those calls go. Because like I said, looking at Cradle to Grave is fine, but if somebody said, hey, Mike, I need you to go ahead and tell me how many calls rolled over from public engagement to employee engagement. If you are just relying on Cradle to Grave, that is very difficult to do, because you essentially have to go through all these rows. Now, my data set is relatively small. Your data set may be thousands and thousands of calls. And when you add Cradle to Grave on top of those thousands and thousands of calls, you end up with a very large report that you're then trying to do pivot tables and Excel files to really just pick out something as simple as this. So one more great example we see that gets used, and focusing a little bit less on queues, is that site information. So isolating how calls go from site to site. So I'm going to go ahead and change our system here, and we're going to go ahead and we want to see called site. And we're going to pick on our Maplewood site because they were getting pretty busy there. All right. So essentially what we have here are all calls going into our Maplewood site. Now we may want to isolate the same thing. You know what? Out of those, what sites are they coming from? In other words, why are all these sites calling Maplewood? Maybe that's part of your business flow and your call flow, or maybe it's a good thing to know. In other words, out of all of these sites, which ones are the busiest? And out of the ones that are the busiest, which ones are the busiest due to internal traffic instead of external traffic? So utilizing Cradle to Grave, we can do that. The same way that we generated our queue-based reports, we can also do the same thing off of our other reports as well. So, and if I look at this, for the most part, we can set this guy up the same way. I can really build out my search sets based off a site or caller site and generate a report that's going to look very similar to this. So you'll notice this guy, instead of looking at the queue, I'm identifying this site. And I'm saying, well, these are all 600 calls that went into my Maplewood site. Out of the 600 calls, 23 of them came from Cedar Valley, 17 of them came from Lakeside Manufacturing, 14 of them came from Timberline. Again, there's a lot of different ways to be able to utilize this data, but the key here is just understanding how to search that data. And the main idea behind searching that data really comes down to what is it that you want to get out, and how can we identify that in Cradle to Grave? Is it site-to-site calling? Is it queue-to-site calling, or maybe queue transfers like we see with this one, queue rollovers? Or even something as simple as like, hey, how many calls came into Mike? And out of all those calls that came into Mike, how many did Mike send off to Victor? It's a very real scenario. We have all these queues, but are they getting sent to individual people, or are they getting sent to other broadcast systems? So utilizing Cradle to Grave, you're really able to pick out a lot of that information, digest it, and really put it in a simple form that's easy for anybody to digest. Great thing is a lot of this information that we see here, and we'll get more into that on a different webinar, as far as the users answering calls, the abandonment ratios, things like that are all part of that. So that same information you can pull on a summary, you can also pull on the Cradle to Grave summary as well. So, a great example is, out of all these calls coming into Maplewood Fabrication that are coming from Cedar Answer, how many of those are being abandoned? Or how many of those are being answered? Is Lakeside Manufacturing, when they call into Maplewood Fabrication, are they getting ghosted and not being answered? So those same statistics that you see down here are all being generated from the Cradle to Grave, and all being generated from those rows that contain Lakeside Manufacturing. All right, Mike, I know we are coming up against time. Do we have any questions that I can answer?
There's the mute button. Question just came in from Joseph. In a Zoom queue, can you set up the call in a Zoom queue, you can set up the call distribution to group rotating, and then set the number of extensions in each group. So it rings, for example, 10 numbers. If no one answers, it calls the next 10, etc., until someone picks up. Can C2G help see how many times a call to a queue gets passed from group to group within the same queue before someone picks up?
So that's going to come down to a little bit on your design. I want to say yes. One way or another, we're going to be able to help because we're going to see where all those calls go. We're also going to see where all those calls ring. So I'll give you a perfect example. Let's say it's not two different queues. We can do group reporting, by the way. But that depends on how you guys are set up in your Zoom environment. But just going off of what I understand that you have going on, call comes in, rings on 10 different users. They don't answer, it rings on 10 different users. That's kind of what I'm going with. What I would do in that particular case is I would run a report on the call queue. Then in my cradle to grave, what I would do is rather than focusing in on another queue, I would focus in on other users. So I would say, okay, out of all the calls that came into my queue, how many ended up going to these other called users? And then in that case, you could actually add those different users right in there and, just add 5 or 6 or 7 or 8, 9 different users into one search set. Then essentially what you're doing is you're saying, okay, anytime a call goes from those first 10 doesn't get answered, it goes to these next 10 users. And we'll be able to summarize that. And you could absolutely get something like this that would contain all 10 of those users. Or if you wanted to add those 10 individual users separately, you could do exactly like we did here. This would just be a username. So long story short, I hope I'm answering your question right, but I think we'll be able to do that for you. All right.
Excellent. That was the only question that stuck in there at the end.
Okay, excellent.